I happen to be, if I'm still a good social democrat, I happen to be one that is, in its view of society, very small L liberal, in that I believe the virtue of living in a decent society is that there is free speech and there is free debate and that there is political freedoms. I can't imagine the beauty. I can't imagine any beauty in living in a one-party state, for example.
Right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today. We've got somebody I'm excited to talk with because we're going to talk about socialism and we're going to talk about Canada, among other things. We've got Professor Alan Mills. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. I just bought an electric vehicle this week and I'm feeling top of the world.
Well, what prompted you to want to get an electric vehicle?
Hopefully to help save the planet, but I'm not sure any small thing can do much these days, but I continue to be hopeful.
Well, we do what we can, right?
We can. I think that's right.
Well, and this ties back into kind of socialism. So can you tell me a little bit about your background in Canadian socialism and why you chose to focus specifically on this research?
Yeah, I came to Canada as a 22-year-old from Ireland. To two Toronto universities, first of all, York University in Toronto, and then to Western University. And I suppose by the time I graduated from Trinity College in Dublin, I thought of myself as a socialist. It was the time of the rise of the Labour Party in England, and I was quite influenced by left-wing professors at university. And so I had to eventually decide on a thesis topic. So I thought of something that was within the tradition of socialist ideas. And I settled on this Canadian review called the Canadian Forum and studied its political position from 1920 to 1934. So that was my thesis topic that earned me a Ph.D.
Was it tough, or did you find it just very easy to read, or were you become engrossed in the story of socialism as you read? Well,
no, I was obviously engrossed in the story of socialism. But, it was, as an academic activity, it was pretty straightforward. I didn't approach it with any great theoretical framework or anything. I take the view that documents, writings, articles, books are there as literary evidence to be reasonably interpreted. Mm-hmm. The trick for writing such a thing is, however, more in terms of the methodology, how you do it, how you pull things together. But anyway, I did that. It wasn't too onerous. The only problem was that I was already married. And there was the question, I was teaching at the University of Winnipeg. And it was a question of time, how to do it, and find the time to do it.
Yeah. And so you wrote this thesis, the Forum of Canadian...
The Canadian Forum and Socialism. Yeah.
And so this is 1920 to 1934. What was happening during this time?
You mean in Canada?
Yeah.
Well, in some ways, of course, like everywhere else, Canada was recovering from the war. Remember that Canada made a contribution to the First World War right from the beginning. It's said that Canada lost as many as 60,000 men in the First World War. That is not inconsiderable. You go to any small town across Canada, you'll see war memorials extensively. I think the war shaked everything up. Remember, there was the famous general strike in Winnipeg in 1919. I always remember watching the movie Reds, and at one point the central character, John Reed, says that everything is now changing, and look, have you not heard of a general strike in Winnipeg in 1919, right? And of course, that was where I was teaching when I came in 1971. But anyway, I was obviously interested in this kind of subject. Once I'd finished studying the Canadian Forum, completed my PhD, moving to Winnipeg, I decided to look at the local scene of socialism in different forms and types. And I started some work on the local Independent Labour Party, which was the forerunner of the eventual CCF, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, that was founded in 1933, whose first leader was Woodsworth. And, eventually then I ended up writing the book on Woodsworth.
Right. And I wanted to, show that.
If I can show it to you.
Yeah, right to a little bit to the, more to the, yeah, there you go. Fool for Christ, the political thought of J.S. Woodsworth. So, in a nutshell, who was this guy? What was his deal?
Well, and he's important because he was the first leader of a Democratic Socialist National Party in Canada, right? Remember that industrialism comes somewhat later to Canada than, say, for example, even I think the United States, but certainly much later than industrialism came to Europe, right? We think of socialism as something that devolves from industrial society, the problem of what Marxists would call the proletariat, what, if you like, democratic socialists would call the working class, right? So it made sense for me to try and make sense of Canadian socialism by spending a lot of time working on Woodsworth, the first leader. It was interesting because, of course, he was a graduate of the university that I was teaching at. His sitting constituency when he entered Parliament in 1921 was a constituency called Winnipeg Centre. So I thought that basically studying Woodsworth would give me entry to the nature of Canadian socialism. I produced the book. It's had some interest. Of course, it's now almost 30 years old. So, I'm not sure that people refer to it anymore. And I think that, the left has become more interested in identity politics than class-based politics. So that in some senses, Woodsworth represents a kind of socialism that has somehow passed away, or at least is much diminished.
And so you think the popularity of socialism in that sense has gone down, while we tend to focus on maybe stuff that's not even that important?
Well, yes, that's, of course, a big question. I'm sure we don't want to get into a red herring that way.
Right. That's a can of worms.
That's a can of worms. Red herrings, can of worms, whatever. It's a diversion. Anyway, no, I think that, as I see it, if you really want my potted version of the evolution of Canadian socialism, there were, to begin with in Canada, partly through immigration from different parts of Europe, small socialist parties established all across the country, but particularly in Winnipeg. It was a major industrial city. And these socialist parties had different points of view. Certainly, some of them were Marxist, and quite clearly Marxist. Some of them took their origins from the British Labour Party, because, of course, I think English-speaking immigrants in the labour movement were very, very important for its leadership. And so, there were a variety of different socialist parties, Marxist, non-Marxist. Some of them had some connection with a strange kind of agrarian socialism, because I think the farmers' movement at that time, particularly in Western Canada, this is just after the First World War, was very, very interested in alternative ideas. It was, of course, the farmers' movement opposed to what they thought was Eastern Canadian monopolies that were strangling the grain trade. The banks, the railway companies, the grain markets, they were sort of, in some senses, exploiting the farmers. But as well as that concern for what they called free trade, agricultural cooperatives to protect farmers in selling their grain particularly, there was as well an interest in sort of quite radical ideas. So there was an element of socialism, if you like, from within the farmers' movement. Now, for a while, of course, there was sort of no pulling together of these parties and points of view. They existed locally. And in 1921, in the federal election, Woodsworth, an important socialist, decided to run for a local Manitoba party called the Independent Labour Party. He went on to Ottawa and was, if you like, the voice of a democratic left, a small democratic left within the Canadian Parliament. Then, the story is in 1932, 33, there was a decision to pull together all of these little parties, some elements of the trade union movement, some elements of the farmers' movement. Also, there was a movement among academics that, by the way, was connected with the early Canadian Forum that I looked at in my Ph.D. They had founded in 1932 a sort of imitation of the British Fabian Society called the League for Social Reconstruction, the LSR. They were very close to what became the CCF, and people who wrote originally for the Canadian Forum and joined the CCF through the League for Social Reconstruction actually wrote the first draft of the Regina Manifesto, which was the great statement of democratic socialism that came out of the founding conference of the CCF in 1933 in the Saskatchewan city of Regina. Hence the name Regina Manifesto.
That's
So you get a National Socialist Party. We have to be careful about sort of how one says National Socialist Party.
Sure.
It was a national, democratic socialist party running all across Canada in the federal election of 1935. Didn't do terribly well, but there it is.
Would these groups be considered radical compared to today's kind of socialist groups, or would they?
Very much, very much. I mean, if you just take Woodsworth and the socialism that he espoused, which I think was very, very representative of the CCF in general, he was a committed socialist, I think, mainly for this reason. The trend of economic development in the industrial world is towards monopolies and trusts. And these monopolies and trusts cannot be made moral sense of in terms of the honest toil of the entrepreneur. They were instead great technological conglomerates that gave whoever owned the monopoly inordinate power that they in some ways then did not deserve. Therefore, there was an argument for having the state own all the significant monopolies in the society. Okay? Banks, insurance, mining companies, railway companies, and so on. So that socialism was socialist in the sense that it wanted to bring large corporations under socialist ownership. For Woodsworth as well and the CCF, it was that then there was to take place, assuming such a socialist party was elected democratically, there would be a strong central planning system put in place in the national capital of Ottawa, and it would be then involved in planning the economy. So I can only assume that you see that that package of ideas would not quite gain much acceptance today, or at least there's limits to how much it would be accepted. I mean, I do think that there is a disposition in some quarters to believe that there is a role for state ownership in some areas. I think the British would like the railways to be back under state ownership. Interestingly, in Manitoba, of all places, they have a state-owned auto insurance company that came along in the 1970s. And no one right now would ever venture to advocate getting rid of it. So, there are these kinds of situations that come along where I think the appeal of public ownership, as it's also called, is a real one. It's potentially popular.
Well, would you say that the backlash from industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, kind of led to socialism in the early 19th 20th century. Isn't it possible that could be happening again, considering that we're looking around and seeing so many problems with capitalism?
Well, I think there's certainly problems with capitalism. It doesn't seem to me that there's any effective present force, political force, to actually overcome capitalism. You know what I mean? I've listened to lectures even as recently as last year by Marxists saying, look, the failure of capitalism is evident, and I think we know what we're meaning by that. But then I posed the question to her, what is the agency that is going to overcome capitalism? Now, Marx, of course, thought it would be the working class, the proletariat. But when you look at the real proletariat of Germany, for example, you have a SDP, a government presently with other coalition partners. But what is that SDP really sort of saying in terms of public ownership? Not very much, I don't think.
Yeah.
And so that is the problem. And I think it is in some senses one of the great existential questions of our time. Capitalism has horrible deficiencies. However, do we see how we can overcome it? Now, if I sort of trace, if you like, the historical development of Canadian socialism after the founding of the CCF, because it didn't make the great breakthrough that it thought it would in the Depression. It didn't. So we go to the Second World War. We get then to the post-war world, and we do get a period. It's the Cold War, of course, internationally. But domestically, it's the period of the state having apparently this wonderful opportunity to introduce what we generally call in the English-speaking world, the welfare state. So you get a Labour government in Britain in 1945. You get, by the way, a CCF government in Saskatchewan in 1944, just before the end of the war. So the CCF begins to succeed a little anyway, at the provincial level, because Canada is a federation. You have, as you have in Germany, a major set of powers at the national level, but regional governments called provinces that have quite substantial powers too. So we begin to build the welfare state, if you like, and it is that, the workers align more with parties that support the welfare state rather than necessarily socialism. So you even get, centrist parties, center-right parties that help build the welfare state. And so through the 50s and 60s in Canada, the CCF, or at least through the 50s anyway, the CCF is in trouble electorally. It can't get close to forming governments, except, by the way, in Saskatchewan, right, which continues to have a socialist government until 1966, I think it is.
Wow.
Now, what you get, I think, and this is the burden of what I try to say and a number of the things I've written, is you get a kind of change from democratic socialism to something called social democracy. Social democracy compared to socialism is intellectually more moderate. It's less radical. It talks less the story of socialism and public ownership, and it talks instead much more the language of government regulation of the deficiencies of capitalism. And so you get the model of social democracy that you remember was very, very popular for a long, long time in Sweden. Sweden, for example, has very little publicly owned companies. What it has is a very strong, aggressive, regulatory state. At least it did until maybe recently, because, of course, things have changed in Sweden, too. In 1961, the CCF decided that it needed to become more mainstream and centrist and changed its name to the New Democratic Party, the NDP. And along with that went greater openness to becoming a party of trade unions, but also a much more, if you like, mainstream, moderate party in terms of what it believed. So it became, I think, a social democratic party with always a sort of socialist fringe on its left. And I think that's where things are today. In regards to Canadian politics, the NDP is present in the national parliament. It has never won national power, but it has done very, very well at the provincial level. So that as well as the Saskatchewan CCF NDP holding power for a long, long time after the war, there has been NDP governments in the province of Manitoba, where I live, in Ontario, in British Columbia, and even in Alberta about 5-6 years ago. So that if you like, the NDP as a social democratic party is building the long march towards winning eventual power nationally, potentially, right? By winning power increasingly at the provincial level. But of course, it's sort of limited. It's limited because it has limited appeal in Quebec. It's now limited by conservative governments that are very strong in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But in Manitoba right now, the NDP, led, by the way, by an Indigenous leader, is poised to win power in this coming provincial election in September, I think it is.
Good. Good to hear. That means that we have a vehicle going forward.
There is a vehicle for people of left-wing views. However, I think it has to be said that it is a moderate party. I mean, I'm sure that environmentalists will worry that it's not radical enough. I'm sure that people who are concerned about redistribution of income, they're worried about it not being radical enough. Mm-hmm. But it also is very, very strong around Indigenous issues, very strong around identity issues, so that it's very, very strong asserting gay rights, trans rights, and so on. I don't know whether you knew it in Germany, but we had a major dislocation of the capital city, Ottawa, back in February last year, the truckers' convoy occupation. Yep. And the NDP was very, very strong in criticizing that protest because it saw the convoy protest as espousing essentially neoliberal ideas.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have assumed that, but yeah, it was a funny group as well. Well,
the truckers, it seems to me, were in Marxist terms pretty bourgeois. That is to say, in many cases, they owned and operated their trucks. They had property in the system.
Sure.
They were like small shopkeepers. And what they wanted was a government that was more libertarian, more open to market forces. They didn't like a government that told truckers whether they should or shouldn't be vaccinated.
Right.
So that was the resistance, whereas the NDP, in support of public health standards, were very strong around the issue of vaccine mandates and lockdowns and things like that.
And public health becomes an interesting topic when you talk about libertarian and socialism versus
exactly, yeah.
Which I'm for. Public health, it's it kind of supersedes egalitarianism. But you also you've published articles about the media of post-communist Czechoslovakia. What role did the media play in the development and promotion of socialism there?
Well, one of the luckiest moments in my life was I got a chance in 1993 to go to Charles University in Prague to teach a small mini course on Canadian studies. I mean, Canadian studies is my specialization, and they had set up a Canadian studies department, and I was invited to go there for 6 weeks. And it was hugely enlightening. I mean, it was my first time in Eastern Europe. Prague is a beautiful city. I just fell in love with the place, and I became very, very interested in what had happened since the wall had come down. And so, I took a little bit of a diversion away from my interest in Canadian socialism and started to actually do some, work on what had happened since '89 in Prague. So I focused on media, just thinking about the transformation, what was going on. I undertook a number of interviews with newspaper editors, academics, people that worked in public policy institutes, and so on, and put together an article. And by the way, we had a lot of exchange going on between my own university and Charles University. We pulled together a couple of conferences, and we actually were able to pull together a book talking about the transformation process, if that's what it can be called, in Eastern Europe after 1989. My interest, as I say, was to look at media, it wasn't straightforward. I became interested in what it would look like if there was, in fact, something called a free media, as opposed to what had prevailed under the Czechoslovak communist system. And, I wrote up my piece and said that, there were things that made the media much more open, pluralistic, committed more to liberal democracy. But there were also, interesting kind of developments, so that, for example, much of the media, some of the media was becoming owned by German entrepreneurs. That was an interesting sideline, right? Germany actually was well positioned to take advantage of the fall of communism. Volkswagen, for example, owns the Škoda factory in Pilsen in Czechoslovakia, or what's now Czech Republic. And, many, many Germans actually bought apartments in Prague after the fall of the wall. But also there were German entrepreneurs that, had an interest in buying up cheap media assets in Czech Republic. I don't need to tell you that there's a concern within Germany over media monopolies, in the media business. So that was beginning to be an interesting sidebar to the story of Czech media after 1989. It wasn't something that I became obsessed by, but I did for a couple of years do that kind of work. I happen to be, if I'm still a good social democrat, I happen to be one that is, in its view of society, very small L liberal, in that I believe the virtue of living in a decent society is that there is free speech and there is free debate, and that there is political freedoms. I can't imagine the beauty. I can't imagine any beauty in living in a one-party state, for example.
Right.
I can't imagine living in a society like Russia today, where the state owns and controls the media. So, that's really how I view things, and I think the developments in Czech Republic convinced me that was true. I was very impressed by Havel. Václav Havel. Read a great deal of his work. It's hard to know what he was politically, but he certainly was very much in favor of aligning Czechoslovakia, then Czech Republic, with Western Europe and Western values and European Union, NATO, and all the thing. And I tend to agree with that. So
would you say, like, the authoritarian kind of modality that comes with communism, when it has to be absolute and you kick out every aspect of capitalism, can that be avoided when you go ahead and kind of marry the two together, as far as capitalism, make a compromise to capitalism, and say, okay, you could let the entrepreneurs do their thing, but on the other hand, have a social safety net?
Well, it's a story for a long debate, Chris. The way I view, and this is maybe rather naive, is that where we are in the West in general, and I would even include the Biden White House as part of this story, it is that we have political parties that govern, and then in some way social democracies, or believe in social democratic values. Basically, it seems to me that what they're saying is there are problems with capitalism. State and government can regulate them. If you don't like that mining companies dump pollutants into rivers, you stop them doing it, right? If you want them to somehow honor certain kind of environmental standards, you pass a law saying that. They can't dump their smoke into the atmosphere. And there are other parts of it. So what you end up with is the idea that socialism will try, or at least social democracy will try to moralize capitalism. Now, Marxists will say, that can't be done. But I think, frankly, pragmatically speaking, it's the only game in town.
Yeah. Well, it's a more...
If you follow what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
I would be very loath to commit the whole of an economy to the massive ownership of the state. So to that degree, the degree to which capitalism is a more or less pluralistic system of private ownership, that has sort of advantages compared to a state-owned economy. All right? Mm-hmm. Now, I say that very pragmatically because I know what the reality is of the political world that I live in. If you were to ask me idealistically, utopian-wise, wouldn't it be great if we had a sort of beautiful socialist state that honored freedom of speech, political pluralism, was generous and decent and treated everybody without any exploitation? Yes, let's have it. I don't see how you immediately get that in the kind of political world we live in. The notion that we get it in China, sorry, not true. Russia, forget about it, especially after the Ukraine invasion. So I think that, I'm a very pragmatic, practical person. I believe in trying to do what I can do in the here and now. And so, it is then that I'm a social democrat of different kinds. I'm not seeing the disappearance of capitalism tomorrow, but I wouldn't want to say that capitalism is without its advantages in some respect, if some of its worst features can be regulated and changed.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a social activist just yesterday, and he was trying to tell me how that he goes to business groups in Winnipeg and tell them to sort of focus on doing things that are socially responsible. In Winnipeg, we have a big issue around Indigenous people. They're moving to the city a great deal. They're coming away from the reserves that live outside the city. And of course, they are suffering from, it's argued, a great deal of trauma because of certain experiences they've had at the hands of the Canadian government. A large story, but it is, the case that Indigenous people have horrible rates of social discomfort, disorder, and so on. High rates of alcoholism, high rates of sexual abuse, high rates of physical abuse, high rates of unemployment. It's a tragic story. So this socialist goes to business people and says, look, why is it that you are not training Indigenous people to work in retail jobs in local shops in Winnipeg? If you're the banks, when you have outlets, if you're McDonald's, you love McDonald's in Germany. I hate it, but never mind, that's all right. Why can't you arrange your affairs so that you hire Indigenous teenagers and young people, to serve behind the counter as a beginning job that earns them income and gives them a steady job for the foreseeable future. So he's very pragmatic, and I see that is the sort of stance that I would take dealing with the evils and disabilities of capitalism.
I would have to agree that if going from this system we have now to a utopia, baby steps. Well,
it has to be baby steps, but it may well be that the baby steps will become bigger steps. You know what I mean?
People have to realize that they like it, right? They have to because right now there's so much fear built up about it. So we have to kind of ease.
Correct. I think that's right. Yeah. No, I hope I haven't contributed to the fear, but I do very much believe that some versions of Marxism really don't have much practical application. It's all very well to make the great indictment of capitalism, but what do you do about it?
Yeah. Maybe 100 years ago, Marxism could have been implemented, but where we are right now, it would be hard to envision it.
Well, precisely. I mean, I think there is an influence from certain Marxist ideas that can be useful, if you like, ways about the world. But the notion, as Marx explained it, was that the working class would be immiserated, reduced to such poverty that it would engage in revolution, and that revolution would install something like a communist party in power, which would then depend upon technology and its wonderful productivity to give everyone a decent minimum income. And we would all go off and play hockey and go fishing and write poetry, and it would all be wonderful. It would be all wonderful. Well, in some ways, we got that after 1917 in Russia, and unfortunately, it wasn't wonderful. So there we go.
For a short amount of time. And then even the French Revolution, after we started guillotining the aristocrats, it didn't take but a few weeks or something. It was a very short amount of time, and then it went back to being sort of a power vacuum. So it's too bad that utopian desires always have these issues of sociological issues behind them, where there'll always be somebody who's willing to get sucked into that power vacuum and take over and take lead. Like we have alphas and we have betas and social hierarchies that obviously are real and are biological. So.
Okay, you're right. You're very welcome. You didn't. We didn't get to talk about Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was the other latest interest that I have. I wrote a book about him. He was Canada's famous prime minister for all of 18 years. Very brilliant man, absolutely brilliant.
I can have you back as early as next week if you want.
Well, if you want to, I'm available. Okay.
Deal.
Okay.
Well, we'll sign.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.